Now I know for many of you, I might sound like a broken record by how many times I say it, but the fact that still remains is that villains are actually the best part of any Disney movie, both either good or bad ones. And in thinking about the past few years of Disney, it just becomes more disappointing on their part for what they actually did in their various stories that have been featured, except for a couple of few. And of course, even more recently, especially with what happened in Wish with a character like Magnifico, the main reason I wanted to talk about this video today. Because Magnifico actually remains to be one of the most anticipated characters in Disney history for the past few years, when they, and Pixar to most extent, either forgot or made horrible twist villains in each of their films, with of course other films like Encanto actually being the exception, with characters like Alma Magico acting more of the antagonist of the film without outright actually being a villain, where of course it's more about the characters and the family in the story and more than what we perceive. But even beyond that, with what we all know in Disney storytelling, they never were able to actually work with all the films, with films like Ralph, Frozen 2, Somewhat Raya and the Last Dragon, and Strange World deciding it would be best to continue without having a villain at all that we come to expect. So having a new villain in this new film Wish would actually be a refreshing return for Disney storytelling to what we actually come to expect. But then again, with what we all know now, that expectation actually turned into disappointment, with a villain like Magnifico being the film's main threat. I mean, I really do think he is the best part of the movie, but it still feels like Disney let us down once again within a film that feels more like a modern allegory for Disney these days. Like, looking at it from that angle, I actually enjoy the movie as a criticism to what the company is right now and what they actually had from before, but still also dissatisfied with something that could have actually been good on its own, like Frozen, or even better. And because of that, there's just so much I want to say about this particular movie right now before it even comes out on DVD or Disney Plus that just comes to mind concerning my love of Disney and its 100-year legacy when Walt actually founded this studio with his brother in his uncle's garage in Los Angeles all those years ago, not knowing how big it would actually get. Where nowadays, with how big they've actually gotten, they've actually become more content on becoming their own villain for the most part, that Magnifico actually represents perfectly, but still unsatisfied for the most part as a regular villain character. Because if you look back on it, he doesn't even compare to greats like Gaston, Ursula, Maleficent, Jafar, Frollo, or even the new modern ones like Turbo. He just feels like more like what Disney expects a villain to be in their past and combined with their present into this one. One with this dark green magic that looks similar to being pure wicked like beings like Maleficent, but then also has this appearance with his wife, who was also considered to be a co-villain in earlier drafts but was actually good instead, that shows something more on the sympathetic side, twisting it a bit earlier to be quite frank, like the recents of Callahan and whatnot in that very regard. It's a movie in two halves of two different ideas, two different stories that don't connect with each other except for the barrage of Disney references that you get in the entire film. Like, above all, since Asha isn't even a really interesting character as the hero in the story, Magnifico actually represents the great problem of something actually being stuck in the past and refusing to change to a future, a combination of villains that don't work in the modern era and the ones that actually did work in the older era. How he really doesn't know exactly what he wants to prove his point about why he keeps these wishes intact, and then again in another half just goes willy-nilly into this pure evil mode by using a book that's sacred for some unexplained reason other than the fact that they don't really use it. Because when you look at Disney's past villains, they all had a purpose to play, whether it be gaining power or keeping it, playing out events to counter the hero and manipulate them to get exactly what they want. All done from this certain position until they actually have it, and then ultimately get bitten by such goals as the hero actually completes their journey in the story. That they knew where they wanted to go from the very start, rather than confusing them halfway or like they even did a decade earlier with other villains like Hans just shoved in right there at the very end for no good reason. Like, I don't really even understand why they are like this these days, where they're making most of their modern heroes quirky and just becoming too scared to have a legit villain in their story, only making this one as a short-term answer to say to the audience that we still do live up to such a legacy, while also foregoing the points about what originally brought them up around the characters. Because looking back on it again, and at the start of the film that references the storybook openings like Snow White and earlier Disney films, is where we do get the background of how he founded Rosas, what he did to keep those wishes and to protect the kingdom from the danger he had to suffer when he was a boy and lost his own family. But then after that, they did a complete 180 to that character in the story, where he seeks to get more power from whatever reason they were going from before and gets defeated by the power of song. Like, when you think about that ending, That really is a borderline parody of Disney itself the more you think about it, considering the story was done by 4 people who worked at Disney, including Disney's own Chief Creative Officer of Animation, Jennifer Lee, trying to find the best way that people would actually like their villains to play out with what they actually personally worked on for the best in the past with other films like Frozen and the overall studio films since 2010. But even looking at them still, I still don't think the faults are solely on them when Disney themselves had to go massive changes in the past year with its CEOs and the problems that have been arising across the company for so long, where the higher-ups just instead latch on to anything that could remotely satisfy their audiences when everything else, including their last animated film, just flopped in theaters. One we all know did not have a distinct villain at all and kinda sorta mocked that certain idea in one scene rather than actually having one to make the story at least more interesting for what it actually had. One that was of course also surpassed by the likes of DreamWorks in the same year with Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, another film that actually includes wishes just like this one to an even better degree that we all praised at the start of this year because of how good it was and the message that the film actually had that actually appealed to everyone, like most Disney movies would usually do, being family films. And the best part of that, which I know considering that this got me on the map, is the fact of the villains of that particular film. 3 separate and distinct villains that had their own purposes chasing next to Puss in Boots for the last wish or his life in the case of death. That this film instead specifically divided each element of a villain against their own hero in their own separate distinct way, with Goldilocks being the more sympathetic type, Death being the embodiment of chaos just choosing to do its job, and Jack Horner just being evil for the sake of being evil. That instead of leaning on one person to do the job, they knew they had to separate each one to tell something in the message that the movie actually wanted to send and whatnot that the wish set out to actually do. Where instead in this film it combined all of that into one era to no great effect. Those 2 halves of Magnifico are somewhat also separate from each other that belong in 2 other drafts of the stories where they actually wanted to work on. Because once again, at the beginning of the film, it goes over certain events of how Rosas actually came to be and what Magnifico did seeing the consequences of his youth with what happened when dreams actually get destroyed, studying this magic to keep these wishes safe and to build a new kingdom where most desires could get granted in a peaceful, safe environment. And for the most part, in the early stages when Asha actually interviews to become his new apprentice, it seems more geared towards his side where we can actually understand and sympathize with what he's actually coming from and what he wants to do with these wishes that selfish, greedy men actually came to destroy with what he had when he was young that he wants to protect so that everyone can actually see their dreams and be protected at all cost. And that is something most of us can actually get behind, that he sees that he does this for a reason that is quite selfless of him, studying this magic to actually make all of their lives prosperous. But then later in the story, we get revealed that Asha's grandfather's wish is actually deemed too dangerous by him, where the 100-year-old man actually seeks to play music that seeks to inspire future generations, which somehow is a threat to his kingdom's safety. Which does work on the fact that he is the main villain, but also not good with where the story is actually headed, where it shows an underlying story thread where he doesn't grant wishes that are a threat to his power that he likes to disguise as strictly for Rosa's own safety. The problem again in this era is that it's an underdeveloped backstory at the beginning at this part of the film, that there is no great indication or lead that shows us this path of why he's actually like this or why he's actually trying to do this. It's just there and it's not actually explained much else after. Like you made us and Asha actually understand that you protect Rosa's because of what happened to you personally that got destroyed, but then later in this moment you immediately wipe that off by having you decide and make people forget what they actually wanted in the first place without any big reason to why it actually happens at all. And then later in the film when Star actually gets introduced, it kinda sorta threatens his hold on the people's wishes where we start to see the cracks open up which could either go any way for this situation, where it can either break Rosa's with what he was trying to protect in the sympathetic route, or it could just either be threatening his power in this situation. Most likely the latter in this situation where everyone can dispose of him if they knew exactly what happened. And in doing the latter, they do it at the cost of removing his character traits they did at the beginning, presented as a likable, respectable king, but now more unhinged and narcissistic, leading him to use the forbidden book which he hides behind this case, which of course presents another problem that this film has in the background of Magnifico's sorcery and the mysterious book that made him go crazy and just have green magic and be evil and whatever. Because you surely must understand in the history of Disney and how other sorcerers and villains use their magic, they use it in such creative ways to actually have something to actually go off of that connects certain points of the story to it rather than just being there for the sake of it. That there should actually be a purpose there to why they actually use the magic that makes them a threat, where he even still mentioned he doesn't want his childhood actually to come true to protect Rosa's at all cost. But instead, in the film, it's not really elaborated enough to what we know at this point, where it just leads them down this path of villainy that we should expect with no real purpose to it, and goes on this frenzy to find a traitor who used that very magic. But then again, that also isn't the worst part of the story, where the worst Disney villain song ever created also plays. Because when you think of the song This Is the Thanks I Get, it sounds way too upbeat and lyrically weird for something that is the villain song of the film. Usually one of the best parts of any Disney movie looking back on their past, with films like my personal favorites being Be Prepared, Poor Unfortunate Souls, Friends on the Other Side, and Hellfire. All songs that fit their characters perfectly with what they're trying to represent compared to whatever this actually was. Now, I don't downright think it's an awful song, where I think the entire soundtrack is still fine, but still not good enough with what you would usually expect for Disney films have going for it in the purpose of musical theater with what they're attempting to do. Which of course is the fault of the direction they actually went for with the very songwriters, having those with the likes of Benjamin Rice and more notably including Julia Michaels, who is an American singer who typically does write pop songs for other artists, where in fact she actually made a song for Ralph Breaks the Internet that plays at the end credits that also relates to a slaughter race in that scene, which evidently was also released the same year they started to work on the ideas for which at this time before they actually revealed they were doing it in the works, wanting her to write the songs to capture the heart of 100 years that most people know in the public hearing these popular songs. Where again, I don't think she was actually a bad idea, and I enjoy these songs separately as their own music, but I really don't think they really got what Disney music should be and it's supposed to be, especially the likes of the villain song in what it actually represents. Where instead, This Is the Thanks I Get seems more like a modern regular hit you see on the radio instead of a threatening villain song you'd expect out of a movie, adding things so simple that it does feel like AI was involved in making lyrics that sound just like this. I let you live it for free and I don't even charge you rent. Like, why the hell is that even a lyric? It's just so redundant to say something like this when you actually made it clear in the first line that you let people live here for free. Where so many of these songs, including the villain one, add too many unnecessary lines or just make it way too more modern than it needs to be compared to the past Disney villain songs. Ones that I mentioned before that both fit the time period and the story flow for those characters much better than this one ever could. It's all done so they can keep rhyming with the flow or whatever to actually have some sense of purpose in the songs. I don't know how to write songs personally or don't study music often, but at the very least I can tell when something makes more sense for a character to do, which none of this movie actually ever did. It just feels not appropriate for the villain to even do, even when he turns in the latter half of the song using these books or whatnot in the darker undertones, still wanting to keep that upbeat flow until the very last second with his last scream, something that solidifies his half-baked turn to evil. Like, this is the part where things have to turn for Queen Amaya in that regard to become the good half because she's always been the positive half to King Magnifico's evil, where things actually looked up before he used that book that has no context other than the fact it's dangerous. A part where one of Asha's friends also actually portrays them and actually reveals that it was her and them all this time when they found it, which also wasn't developed well because they had too many characters within such a short amount of time without any real substance. And when you think of that part and Asha's friends, it makes them feel a little bit more abrupt because of what happened off screen rather than what could have been with a single hint towards it. Like, you should have at least showed us more in his own story and a flashback if you actually wanted that. I don't think anyone actually hates his character if we look at each version that Chris Pine actually did a good job at, but it really just needed something that most villains should have had from the start with that background. Because that was also something that was hinted to in the song Knowing What I Know Now, when Amaya decides to join Asha and side with her to overthrow Magnifico and give the people their wishes back, where she said personally that Magnifico was actually kind and loving and all these things, which we actually never saw at all. Like, the writers actually forget that there is a history in that part too that was intended for them to both share a villain role and then change to something more familiar in modern times to be more sympathetic. How they just needed to find reasons to make her more character relevant for the actual plot instead of what they actually remembered in Disney villains that should be villainous in some way, using some green magic with his staff to trick everybody instead of something more inspired and creative with this entire concept. Like, this part is just so stupid where he's just evil for the sake of being evil that is way worse than what you could have had fun with what I mentioned earlier with Jack Horner and all the other villains that split off into what they knew, what character identity they had from the start, for getting a logical reason to how a villain gets the upper hand in this part where they literally had all the power in the world to keep it under control. It just doesn't make sense because you have all these ideas that contradict the character moving back and forth within each other. It doesn't make sense, and characters like Amaya should know it because they personally honestly knew them until they used this book that had no context other than the fact it makes you more evil. And in doing this final scene where he gets the upper hand, they back themselves into a corner, finding a way to actually try to defeat him because he has all these powers that keeps them all locked, doing the lamest thing ever being the power of song with the fact that everyone is made up of stardust or whatever they were going for early in the film that is supposedly the backstory to the wishing star. Like, they really become lazy on that part to know how exactly he's defeated to what they actually wanted to do for with the I'm evil bad guy for this part of the film, throwing out every other idea they had to complete his journey from the film out the window that could have actually been compelling. It's just something that keeps going up and down the scale that knows not where it should actually go, and to finish off trapped in this mirror like he was at the final defeat, trying to do something typical of what usually happens without knowing why they actually did it in the first place. So I guess in short, Magnifico on paper and what was presented with Wish was absolutely great and a return to something Disney storytelling should have, but just fell back short, and what the company actually expects is sellable to the public with their catalog of films and merchandise, thinking back on the history that's already been done, that already worked, that people actually want to see again, while also staying relatively in that same safe play area that they actually know can work for the most part of this world, which quite frankly doesn't actually work anymore when their own messaging is just falling flat with those very same audiences in the very contentious time such as this. How people like us just want the stories they know back that's able to actually deliver itself all the way through, that includes the villains that are heart of their very stories. Where it's just that this film specifically, beyond its critical and financial failings, has just so many things to talk about that really wastes the potential that was built over 100 years like they advertise it, expecting to be bigger and bolder but still regressed and too afraid to provide meaningful character changes. That this is the new legacy the current leadership have displayed, mismanaging Disney on what people think they want rather than what we actually want. Where in a nutshell, they instead become the greatest Disney villains they've ever produced that will never learn from their own mistakes and will remain that way until their reign finally ends for the better. And with that all said, I'm all done, so goodbye.